Psalm 111, we'll continue where we started last Sunday, reminding you that this psalm is a celebration of the works of God. They are mentioned several times. And I just want to begin by reading the first 4 verses, and I won't even finish expounding them today. If you have your Bible open, would you read them with me, please, the first 4 verses? Praise ye the Lord. I will praise the Lord with my whole heart in the assembly of the upright and in the congregation. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. His work is honourable and glorious, and his righteousness endureth forever. He hath made his wonderful works to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and full of compassion. Now, the first thing I want to point out is what was mentioned there in verse 1 is exactly what you're doing today. You are praising God in the assembly, in the congregation of the upright, and I trust that you are praising Him with your whole heart, that your whole heart, all within you, is involved in what you're doing today. And then we really didn't get past verse 2. The works of the Lord are sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. And we pointed out that God has called us to contemplate, to seek out, if you will, His works, because there's something there to be discovered in the things that He has done. And we find out that as we seek out God's works, unless our hearts are completely blinded, we come to realize, number one, that there is a God, that He is, and number two, that He is great, and therefore nothing is too hard for Him. And it talks about God's works being sought out by those that have pleasure in them. And the particular pleasure here is beyond the pleasure that most any man finds when he's researching something. It's researching that something with the idea that this something is the work of God. There are many people that find pleasure in searching out His works, but they're only really searching it out as stuff that's just there to be searched out. They're not looking beyond the stuff to where the stuff came from. They're viewing it as a work, but not as the work of the Lord. But this says that the works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. Because you see, when you look at the works of God, you're seeing the evidence of God staring you in the face, if you bother to ask the questions. And I pointed out that many people will research the works of God, but they do not ever ask or consider such questions as, why does anything exist in the first place? Why do things work the way they do? Why are we here? And where are we ultimately going? And like I said, you can find a limited answer to that question, why are we here? Well, my parents fell in love, got married, wanted kids, and therefore I'm here. But that's a very short-sighted answer. Like I said, you've got to go further. Why is there such a thing as parenthood? Why is there such a thing of an attraction of the opposite sexes that results in an institution of marriage, that results in people having children and families? Where did all that start? Why is it that way? Those are the questions. I preached a sermon a number of years ago. Some of you may remember it. It was entitled, They Don't Ask the Questions. When you talk about asking questions, I thought about this week, and I thought it was quite interesting. Now, there can be different reasons why people ask questions. For example, you may already know the answer, and you may be asking another a question to see if they know the answer. That's what happens in school all the time. Or you may recognize that another person's position is fallacious, there's something wrong with it. And you may ask that person questions to get them thinking so that they can see the error of whatever it is they think or believe. But then there's this other kind, and this is the kind I'm talking about. And that's where you want answers. You want to know. And so you ask the questions to find out. And that's just the kind of questions that men are responsible to ask as it respects the world in which they live, which is the work of God. Again, questions such as, why does anything exist at all? Why do things work the way they do? Why are we here? And where are we ultimately going? Think of that word question and look at that verse again. We're looking at verse 2. The works of the Lord are great, sought out. Sought is the past tense of seek. You seek out. And if you did it in the past, you sought it out. Get that word seek. Because if you look at the word question, notice that it is related to the word quest. You're familiar with that word. And what is a quest? A quest is a search for something. You're looking for something. You want to find something. So you go on a quest. And that's what a question is. It's a form of a quest to seek, search, and find out something. But the problem with men, fallen men, is they don't ask the questions. And this is why they don't get the answers. They look at the stuff. They may be very fascinated by the stuff, but they never get beyond the stuff by asking the questions is, why is the stuff there to start with? And this is one of the evidences of the fact that all men are fallen and sinners, because we read in Romans 3 and verse 11, there is none that understandeth. Why don't they understand? There is none that seeketh after God. Or if I may rephrase those words, there are none that ask the questions that find their answers in God. Now, you look at the world in which you live, and again, you look at the mountains, the sunrise, sunset, the clouds, the stars, the ground, the earth, the flowers, the plants. We could go on, the oceans, the waves. It is so important to look at all of these things, and yes, we are awestruck by them, and I'll talk about that as we move on. But again, to look beyond them and ask the questions, why do the waves beat on the shore? Why do we have planets? Why does the earth, this earth revolve around the sun? And why is it there to start with? And on we could go. And of course, the ultimate answer to those questions is God. Because as I've pointed out to you repeatedly in the past, that when you look at the world in which we live, you see this chain of cause and effect. Everything is an effect that can be traced back to a cause, which is itself the effect of another cause, and on and on. And if you follow that chain of cause and effect back, you are going to come to a first cause. You have to. Because if there is no first cause, guess what? There's no second cause, no third cause, fourth cause, and so on. So you've got to come back to a first cause, and that first cause must be itself an uncaused, infinite cause. If the first cause has a cause, it isn't the first cause. And if the first cause is not infinite, and when I say infinite, I mean without limits, without boundaries. If the first cause is not infinite, then that cause has a boundary. It has a limit. In other words, it has a place where it begins. And if it has a place where he begins, what began it? So you still have not arrived at the first cause. So logic, say you never read a Bible in your life. If you have learned to think logically and think in terms of cause and effect, and you think it back, you ultimately have to come back to God. This world, this universe proclaims the existence of God. The evidence is staring us in the face every which way we turn. But again, the problem is men do not ask the questions. But I've used this illustration before. It's very simple. Even a child can understand. Here's a watch. Now, does it take a lot of imagination for you to come to the realization that somebody made it? I mean, do you honestly think this watch just happened? That there was an explosion somewhere and a bunch of pieces came together and this is what happened? Do you honestly believe that? This watch argues a maker. It argues a designer. And what can be said for this simple watch? can be said for the universe in which we live. This is a time teller, but this is nothing to compare with the sun and the moon and the way we reckon time by the motions of those bodies in the heavens. So anyway, God, when He created the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars, He hung a clock whereby we measure our days, our months, and our years. Fascinating when you think about it. And just as this clock argues a designer and a maker, so does that clock. If you think logically, and if you ask the questions, you go on the quest, you seek, those works are sought out. Now, if God made all things, and we're going to assume for the moment that He did. I have more arguments to advance for that as we move on. But just say for the moment, if God made all things, then it follows God made you. Now, here's something. Did you notice that God did not consult with you before He made you? He did not let you decide whether you would be or why you should be. One day you just happened to be, and you were not consulted as to the why or wherefore or even that you would be. So from this it follows that the ultimate purpose for your being is found in the one that gave you that being. And again, when you look at the chain of cause and effect, when you look at one generation producing another generation, producing another generation, as we say, you follow that back, you're ultimately going to have to come to the first cause that set the production of generations in motion. And that first cause, of course, is God. So it follows that if God made you, and this is one of the things that we acknowledge when we come to God in worship. One of the great psalms of worship is Psalm 100. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Come before His presence with singing. And one of the things it tells us to do as we approach God in worship is, know ye that the Lord, He is God. Acknowledge God for who He is, and that He hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are not the product of ourselves. We are the product of God. So it follows that the ultimate purpose of our being is not found in ourselves. It is found in God. One of the saddest things is you have so many people wandering around out there in the world trying to find themselves, trying to find their purpose, trying to find their destiny. They're not looking far enough. You will never truly find yourself till you find the God that made you and come to learn what His purpose is in your being here. You see, these questions, as we showed last time, don't have the ultimate answers in themselves. That nature does not provide the ultimate answers to these questions. These questions can only be answered. They can only find a rational answer in God and in His will and purposes, which is what this psalm is teaching us. So if God made us, it follows that the purpose for our being will be found in God rather than ourselves or rather than in others. And do you suppose, and I posit the question for your consideration, again, asking the questions sets us to where we can find out. You don't ask the questions, you don't find out. You don't seek, you don't find. What did Jesus say? Seek, and you shall find. So the reason a lot of people don't discover God is they don't go looking for Him in the first place. So, do you suppose that if the ultimate purpose in being, the purpose for why you are here, is found in God, do you suppose that God would let you in on what that purpose is? Of course, the answer to the foregoing question will move one to consider, where did God give me that answer of why I'm here, why and what is the purpose of my life? The answer to that question is going to move you to consider a revelation of God beyond what we find in nature and in the creation, which of course as Christians we believe that revelation is found in the Bible. That this is the book that tells us why we're here, where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going. But I'm just pointing that out for a consideration. It just seems to make sense that if God made us, He'd let us in on why He did it. And indeed, and in fact, He does. But I tell you what, you aren't going to find it on a hike in the mountains. You're not going to find it surfing on an ocean. You're not going to find it in a microscope studying the makeup of your body. You will discover great wonders there, awesome wonders. But they're not going to give you the answers of why you are here and what the purpose of your being is. Something beyond nature that's let us know. And it makes sense that the God that made all nature would be the one to give us that information, since He obviously made us and He had a reason to do so. Now, here's the point. As you seek out the works of the Lord, and again, this is what everybody does. Everybody, to some extent, makes some kind of search into the world in which they live, if for no other reason than just to enjoy it. I want to go see what the Grand Canyon looks like. I want to go to the Great Rocky Mountains. I'd like to see what they look like. Or I'd like to go to some other country and admire its architecture and its culture, and on and on and on down the list we could go. Or I'd like to learn deep sea diving so I could see something of the riches of the depths of the oceans. And on we could go. But as we seek out these works of God, if that search, hold it now, does not terminate in the knowledge of the true God, then an inferior God will be substituted as the cause of the works. Some God will be found out, but if it doesn't terminate in the true God, then a false God will be substituted. And the Bible even teaches this. If you come over to Romans chapter 1, we'll give you the example of this. If you go over to Romans chapter 1, one of the most philosophically outstanding statements in the whole Bible. In verse 20, for if the invisible things of Him, this is talking about God, He is the antecedent of this pronoun Him. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. Even though God is invisible and we don't see Him, we see the things that point to the fact that He is there. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Just look. You don't know who made this watch. You've never seen Him. He's invisible to you. But do you doubt for a moment He's there? You see the product of His genius. You see the product. You see His work. It's the same way in the world in which you live. You may not see Him, but you understand the very fact this is here argues He is there. And so the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. And what do we understand? Even His eternal power. A God that made a world like this must be very, very powerful. And Godhead, His supremacy, the fact that He is beyond it all, and thus had the power to make it all, so that they are without excuse. The evidence for the true God is there. No man has an excuse for not believing in the real God. Because that, when they knew God, they knew there was a God there. They glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful. And we talked about this before, the tragedy of how many people live in this world and enjoy the good that God has built into this earth and its systems, and never ever thank God for it. Never acknowledge God in it or ask anything from His hand. They were not thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Now here's an atheistic scientist described in perfect language, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Anybody that denies the existence of the one infinite, eternal God is a fool. The Bible says, the fool that said in his heart, there is no God. Because it's so logical. It's so logical to believe that He is there. So to deny it is the ultimate of being illogical, which is what a fool is. And they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things, which the heathen have done for centuries, worshipping all kinds of images and statues that they've created, claiming them to be God, or representing God. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So you can clearly see from this passage that if men in their research of things, if that research does not terminate in the knowledge of the one true infinite God, then inferior gods will be substituted as the cause of the works. And this is the origin of all heathen religions, with their many and limited deities and idols, statues and pictures and so forth that men worship. But what about the atheist, who denies that there is any God at all? What about him? Well, I want to read something that Paul J. Glenn wrote in an excellent treatise called An Introduction to Philosophy. It is a book I would highly recommend. An Introduction to Philosophy by Paul J. Glenn. And this is an observation he made that I think is fascinating. He said, the atheist never utterly denies God. He replaces God by something inferior, which he calls nature. And hence you hear all this talk about Mother Nature did this, Mother Nature did that. Notice how they personalize nature as having some ruling, controlling force. Why do they personalize it? I'll tell you why. Because the concept of the concept of a personal God is inescapable. And so they ascribe it to nature and personalize it. So the atheist never utterly denies God. He replaces God by something inferior, which he calls nature, or energy, or forces. I can remember my Russian tutor talking one time. Of course, she was raised up in Russia under atheistic communism. And she said that, I believe there's some kind of force. That was her idea of God. So he replaces God by something inferior, which he calls nature, or energy, or forces, or eminence. And that's that idea that God is just an idea we have, or even chance. For if nature explains things, then the atheist means by nature what we mean by God. For if nature explains things, then the atheist means by nature what we mean by God, although he probably gives a narrow and imperfect character to nature. That is, he sets up inferior gods, but some gods he inevitably sets up. Inevitably. I mean, you will even hear people talk about evolution, and they'll personalize it. Well, evolution did this. I don't understand why evolution did it that way. As though, do you see what they're doing? They're describing it like some person that's making decisions and thus executing its actions. Again, all they're doing is substituting nature for God, or what they perceive as nature and evolution, which is a whole different subject. I'm not going to go there. But anyway, I want you to observe, however, Romans 1 makes it crystal clear that this substitution of inferior gods originates in the knowledge that there is a God after all. Therefore, God is an inescapable concept. Let me say it again. God is an inescapable concept. There is no way you can escape the fact or the reality of God. He's where you came from. He's the one that's holding you together. And He is the one to which you will appear and before whom you will come. You will encounter God, no matter how much you may run from Him now or deny Him. You see, the belief in God, the belief that there is a God, is the most fundamental article of our holy faith. Hebrews 11:6 says, and you came to church this morning. You came to church to worship God, to come into His presence and answer to His call. But in coming here, for that coming to please God, you must come with this realization. Hebrews 11:6, but without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he that cometh to God must believe that He is. The existence of God, the Supreme Being, is the most fundamental article of our faith. And then believe that He is a rewarder, but notice, of them that diligently seek Him. If you really want to know that God is there, if you really want to know this God, understand this God, and thus discover your purpose, that pursuit, that quest will be rewarded if diligently engaged in. It will. You will find out. You will find the answer. Now, this is the most fundamental article of our faith, and everything else we believe is based on it. I mean, if there's no God, what are we doing in this church this morning singing, "Who flung the stars out into space and holds them in their proper place"? What in the world are we doing in here singing, "This is my Father's world"? Why do we sing the doxology, "Praise God, from whom all blessings flow"? This whole book is a lie. It's a joke. Pitch it. If there is no God. I mean, everything about our holy religion is founded on that fundamental principle. There is a God. There is God. Because you see, if a man is not convinced that God exists, it is pointless to argue any other point of theology or even morals with him, since the existence of God lies at the root of all theology and all morality. If he doesn't even believe in God, what's the point of saying, "Well, you know, in our church we believe in the doctrine of election"? We believe God chose whom He will save. Well, if you don't believe in a God, you're certainly not going to believe in a God that chooses those whom He saves. I mean, you haven't even crossed the first base yet. It's pointless to argue those kinds of things. But sadly, this is the situation you will encounter very often in our modern age. I have told this story before. I know I have. And I'm going to tell it again. And some of you are going to remember that I told the story. This is not an evidence of dementia. Sometimes when I repeat myself, it might be old age manifesting itself. That's not what's happening here. I'm going to tell this story again for a couple of reasons. Number one, some of you, when I told it before, may have been too young to even know what I was talking about or to remember it. Secondly, we have visitors here that have not heard me tell this story before. I speak the German language. And back in I was teaching adult education German classes, and back in 1995, I made a trip to Berlin by myself just to immerse myself in the German language to improve my understanding and speaking skills. And it was during that trip that I met our dear friends Manfred and Helga Kropp, who have visited this church. You people know them. Sadly, Manfred died here in the summer just before Conrad died in September following. His wife is still living, and I communicate with her from time to time. in German, because they don't speak English, or he didn't, and she doesn't. So anyway, but I'd gone on this trip, and I was so close to Poland. You have two Frankfurts in Germany. You have Frankfurt on the Rhine River, which is the one most people know about. That's the main airport people fly into. And then there's the Frankfurt on the Oder River, and that belonged to the former East German Republic, and that's just over the border from Poland. So one day, I took a train trip to Frankfurt am Oder so I could walk over the bridge and go to Poland and tell the world I'd seen Poland. And while I was on this trip, I sat by a young college student, and we struck up a conversation. I think he was going home to visit his mother. He went to school in Berlin, and we decided to hook up one evening when we were back in Berlin. And we did, and had dinner together. We wanted to go to a movie. And there was this German movie that was very popular at that time, and it was about a homosexual. And he wanted us to go see this movie about a homosexual. And I told him, I'm not interested in that. I don't buy into that. I don't believe in that. And letting him know that that was a moral issue for me. Well, that, of course, led into this discussion of, is it right or is it wrong to be homosexual? And I told him, I said, look, this discussion is pointless until you and I can agree on a moral standard, an absolute moral standard to which all men are accountable. And that standard will decide whether it is right or wrong. And in the absence of having such a standard to define right and wrong, really all it's going to be devolved down into is an exchange of opinions. And that isn't worth anything. So what we ended up doing is we did go to the movies, and we watched that movie Speed. Dan, I think you and I went to see that one together. And it was in German. The language had been dubbed over in German. So we watched Speed in German, and we both enjoyed it. He enjoyed it. He'd not seen it before. So we ended up having a delightful evening, but we really didn't get anywhere in that discussion for the reason that I said. So here's this thing. We've got to start with the acknowledgement that God is there in our approach to witnessing with people. But it's like something Matt Ruma pointed out to me the other day when we were on one of our walks together. We usually take a little stroll together on the 4th of July and have some delightful conversations. And he pointed out, you know, in the day and age in which we live, sadly, so often, you can't even start with, is there a God or not? You have to step back behind that and ask, can we know truth? Is truth knowable? Can we know for sure that something is true? You see, many people think truth is relative. I have my truth, you have your truth, which ends up being nothing more than the exchange of opinions. Is truth knowable? Can we know with absolute certitude that something is true? And of course, you've heard me point out before that that philosophy that you cannot know absolutely that something is true is turns on its own head. Because is it absolutely true that there is no absolute truth? Well, if it's absolutely true that there's no absolute truth, guess what? There's absolute truth. You see, it's an inescapable, absolute truth is an inescapable concept. This idea that it's there if I think it's there. But if I don't think it's there, it's not there. Tell a person that believes that when you're standing on a street corner and a bus is coming down the street, walk in front of that bus. It's not there unless you think it's there. He lives in a world where you have to be able to know for sure that certain things are. And so the first thing, sadly, nowadays, is you have to back up and just discuss, do you think truth is knowable? Because if you don't, then we have nothing we can discuss. But if you can get past that base, then we can start reason from there to God. And then the next thing is when you talk to people in our modern generation, even if a person acknowledges God, what is his concept of the nature of God? What does he think God is like? And if he attempts to answer that question, you will often find that his concept of God is a product of his imagination rather than divine revelation or logic or reasoning. It is just, well, I feel God would not do this, but I think he would do this. And all they do is spiel out their imagination. I had this conversation one night at a Spanish meetup. There was a lady sitting across from me, and somehow I guess the subject of the whole homosexual question came up, and we started going into a discussion of religion, and she just thought this was wonderful. She just loved talking about these things. And they, we shouldn't judge, and far be it from me to judge, and she likes this new pope because he's more open-minded, And so anyway, it went on like that, and then she started telling me her concept of hell, that she didn't think there would be such a thing as eternal suffering, and she thinks hell is just what we suffer in this way. And all this woman is doing is just spieling out her imagination. What she no Bible verses, nothing. And if you gave her Bible verses, I can promise you the answer. Well, that's your interpretation. What do you mean, my interpretation? If this is what the words on the page say, definitionally and grammatically analyzed, it ceases to be a matter of personal interpretation. It's what the words say. But that's what the people will hide behind. Well, that's your personal opinion. That's your personal interpretation. And how do you get anywhere like that? You know what? You don't. End of conversation. That's it. You're not going to convince everybody. It's just the way it is in the world we live in. So I'm coming back to my major point, that this thing of the existence of God, as he is revealed in the creation, is the first and most fundamental article of our faith and holy religion. Richard Baxter, you say, who was he? I haven't the foggiest idea. I just happened upon a quote of his in a commentary on the Psalms by Charles Spurgeon. But it doesn't matter. I say this, the man knew what he was talking about when he said it. Richard Baxter, and this is what he said: to see and admire, to reverence and adore, to love and delight in God appearing to us in his works, and purposefully to peruse them for the knowledge of God, this is the true and only philosophy, and the contrary is mere foolery, as so called again and again by God himself. True philosophy is loving and delighting in God appearing in his works, admiring him, admiring what he's done, and having reverence and adoration for him in that. Which brings us now to our next verse. We're grinding through this rather slowly, aren't we? Take a breath, and I'll take a drink of water. His work is honorable and glorious. Now, in this church, we strongly emphasize defining terms. God has revealed himself revealed himself to us in a book that is made up of language that, in order to understand it, the language must be defined, and the construction of the sentences must be analyzed. That's called grammar, by the way. His work is honorable and glorious. Now, notice we're talking about something, God's work. The word honorable means worthy of being honored, which doesn't tell us a whole lot. But when you're talking about things such as God's work, it means that his work is characterized by or accompanied with honor, which is respectful admiration. It means that that work is bringing or fraught with honor to the possessor, who happens to be God. Just to illustrate it, you look at a sunset, a beautiful sunset. You and your girlfriend are looking at it on a romantic evening. And if you can get your mind off of each other, you look at that sunset and you think, isn't that magnificent? You just are awestruck by the beauty of the sunset. That's honor by definition. You are admiring and even awestruck and in respect of what you are looking at. But then if you think like you should think, you look beyond the sunset and you are in awe of and you honor God who made it and possesses it. You see in that beauty and resplendence the evidence of God. As one small example, and we could go on and on. Have you ever been in a planetarium where you sit back and you look at the stars and the galaxy? Oh, it's amazing. You're just awestruck by the number of the stars, the brilliance of the stars, the constellations, the moving of the planets. It's that kind of thing when you see something that is so magnificent, a show of genius, a show of brilliance, and you just look at it, and to use one of Fred Hodgson's favorite words, you look at it and you go, wow. Whenever you see something and you go, wow, that's something honorable by definition. And then glorious means it possesses glory, which is something that brings honor and renown. Resplendent beauty, that means shining beauty, like the shining of the stars, the shining of the moon, the shining of the sun. Resplendent beauty or magnificence. It's that thing you look at again. It's much the same idea with the word honorable. In fact, the word honor is used to define glorious. So they really are two words pretty well pointing us in the same direction. They are things that are magnificent, radiant, beautiful, that inspire awe, both of the thing itself and the one that did it. For example, another example. Supposing someone in here paints a picture, and it's a beautiful picture, and maybe they have it hanging in their living room, and you go in and you say, my, that is you're just like kind of taking, your breath is kind of taken away. My, wow, that is beautiful. Who did that? Well, I did. You did that? Did you see what was happening there? Do you see that the admiration that you had for the work now transferred to the worker? Johann Sebastian Bach, one of my favorite pieces of music, the Fugue in D minor. Man, I'm listening to that music. If I put that thing on while I'm driving down the highway, I'm going to go over the speed limit. That thing gets into me. I love it. My grandson Justin did me an honor one time. He played the piano version of it at his recital, and he warned everybody in advance. There's a point where there's a chord there, my favorite part, that I might lose it. I mean, I just go bananas over that chord. Well, so that piece of music, I can only say, is honorable and glorious. And it makes me admire the genius of a man that could write music like that. Do you ever, if you hear Handel's Messiah, what a magnificent production. But what does that say for the man that composed that? What kind of genius? So you see what I'm saying here? What I'm trying to show you, honorable and glorious. It's that feeling we get when we look at a beautiful mountain range, and on I could go, or beautiful flowers, or tiny insects, or the workings of the human body. All of these things we could classify as honorable and glorious. And it is a fact that God's creation of all things brings him honor and glory because he's the possessor of it. He did it. So we move from honoring the thing to the God that made it. And this is what they do in heaven, as we shall see in Revelation 4, 10 and 11, which we cited last Sunday. There are 24 elders that fall down before him that sat on the throne, who is God, and worship him that liveth forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, and this is why they worship, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive honor, to receive glory and honor and power. Why? For thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. So God's work of creation is something that brings him honor and renown and glory if we see it for what it really is. Not just beautiful stuff to look at and admire, but the handiwork of God and the genius and brilliance and power of God that produced it. Amen. In fact, we have this verse in Psalm 19 and verse 1. I love the way it words it. The heavens declare the glory of God. Stand back. Look at the sky. Look at the clouds. Look at the balancing and movement of the clouds and the beautiful, bright blue sky. You can't look at the sun directly, but you can take a passing glance. Or go out on a night, if you live where you can see it, and see all the multitudinous stars and the moon. Look at all of that. And who can come away and not say, wow, this is brilliant. This is magnificent. Which is just another way of saying this is honorable and this is glorious. But again, if you ask the questions, if you look at it the way you should look at it, the heavens are not just declaring glory, which they are declaring the glory of God. They are all preaching to us, God is there. This is His handiwork. This tells you something about God. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth forth His handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. Very often in the summertime, I combine my prayer time with walks in our complex. And I very often start out, as I look at the beautiful trees in our complex and the grass, and you can see flowers, and then I look up and I see the sky and I see the clouds. And I begin my prayer and I say to God, because the Bible teaches us, the heaven is His throne and the earth is His footstool. I come before Thee, O God, under the canopy of heaven, which is Thy throne, to pray to Thee. You see what I'm doing in the beginning of the prayer? Is I'm acknowledging what those heavens declare, the glory of God. I acknowledge God and I commune with Him in the temple of the universe. Now, we should stand in awe and admire God's work for just what it is, and thus be moved to worship God because of it. But there is this point, stay with me. I want to narrow this down, this concept of work being honorable and being glorious. And that is that even men in this world possess honor and glory and do works that are honorable and glorious. This is not an unbiblical concept, as I shall show. In the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 45, and I'll not give you the background other than this man Joseph was exalted to be second in command of the most mighty empire of the time in history, the nation of Egypt. He was the prime minister to Pharaoh, second in command. He had the command of the whole land. And he says to his brothers to go back and tell his father in Genesis 45:13, you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt. It is a glory, something quite admirable, to see a man with that kind of power. And then you can look over in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 18. Daniel chapter 5 and verse 18. This is talking about the great king of the empire of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. And it says, O thou king, the most high God, gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. If you could have gone and have seen the kingdom of Babylon, over which Nebuchadnezzar had the command and control, you'd understand this man possesses glory and honor. And if you're one of the subjects of his kingdom, you better figure that out real quick like, and not provoke a man that has that kind of power. And then not only does glory arise from a position of power, it also arises from possessions. when a person is very rich and can have a palatial estate and the finest of cars and have horses and properties and lakefront properties. Now, we could go at all these things that money can buy. You could say that that person, that's their glory. They possess glory by having great riches. Riches are referred to as glory in Psalm 49, 16 and 17. While you're looking, I shall ask all of you, how glorious are you? How glorious is your bank account? How glorious is your pocketbook? God does not distribute glory evenly. But in Psalm 49, 16 and 17, be not afraid when one is made rich, when the glory, see, that's his wealth, of the house is increased. For when he dieth, he shall carry nothing away, his glory shall not descend after him. Riches are something you get to enjoy for a while in this world, but you cannot carry them with you. And then, 2 Samuel chapter 23, glory may arise from accomplishments. One possesses, one's work is honorable and glorious in its accomplishment. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, and I'm not going to read it, but if you read verses 8 down through verse 23, and really following, you read a list of David's mighty men. These were the most accomplished, mighty men that he had in his employ and in his military, in his army, of which he was the commander. But in the beginning, in these first verses from 8 to 23, it describes the accomplishments of some of David's mighty men. And I want you to notice how it's described in verse 19. Was he not most honorable of the three? And then verse 23, he was more honorable than the 30. Now the only point I'm after is to show you that these men, by virtue of their accomplishments, are called honorable. Their accomplishments were honorable, such that you honor men that could do things like this. And this is true on so many fronts. I'd like to give an example of a work that is glorious and honorable. And I'm going to single you out, Josh, and Dr. Edward Bouvet, that pioneered the surgery that saved your life as a baby, so that you sit there today, a tall, handsome, strapping, strong, energetic young man. Any more compliments you need? I thought I'd throw a little honor in your direction. Who would dispute with me for one moment that the pioneering of that surgery, for had you been born when I was born, you would not have survived. We called people that had your condition, called hyperplastic left heart syndrome. He had an imperfectly developed heart. We called them, when I was young, blue babies. And they only lived a few days and they died. He lives today because of Dr. Edward Bouvet, that pioneered this surgery to reroute the way the blood flows in his body so that this man survives with a piece of a heart. Who in here would dispute that the work, the accomplishment of Dr. Edward Bouvet is honorable and glorious? Honorable and glorious. And don't feel singled out, Josh, because I point out that you are surviving today as a result of heart surgery. So am I. As you all know, I was a heart attack waiting to happen, and had I not had that corrective surgery in February, there's a good chance I wouldn't be standing here today. Your grandfather is there because of two of them. Sandra St. Clair Hanley is there because of it. So we also owe our life to this glorious, honorable work of heart surgery. We admire these men and we admire their accomplishments. And do we not admire the accomplishments of men in architecture, medicine, technology, the arts, and on we can go. However, just as it is with the mountain ranges, with the oceans, the fields of grain, the trees, the flowers, the animals, the plants, so it is with the creative genius of men We look beyond that and recognize that any honor and glory that men justly have in this world, they derive from God. But man's honor and glory that he derives from God fades. And that takes us somewhere. But let me just show you this. Come over to 1 Chronicles 29. 1 Chronicles 29. I know to our visitors, our sermons probably sing endless. But believe me, trust me, they do end. And we are coming into the final stretch. So I just hang in there with me. 1 Chronicles 29 and verse 12. Both, David is speaking to God, both riches, remember riches can be glory, riches and honor come of thee, and thou reignest over all. And in thine hand is power and might, and in thine hand it is to make great and to give strength unto all. Glory and honor all come from the hand of God. Like he said, honor together with riches come of thee. And then look at verse 28, that just happens to mention King David. And it says in verse 28 of the same chapter, he died in a good old age, full of days, riches and honor. Where did David get that from? He just said it came from God. And then, but yet, like we say, it fades with the passage of time. What about the glory of wealth? Back in Psalm 49, it says in verse 12, nevertheless, man being in honor, no matter what that honor is, whether it's a king in a palace or a renowned physician or a great and esteemed musician, you name it, man being in honor abideth not. He doesn't continue in that state. He ends up dying just like his dog. He's like the beasts that perish. And then 1 Peter 1:24. 1 Peter 1 and verse 24. For all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of grass. The grass withereth, the flower thereof falleth away. So whatever honor and glory men have, they get it from God. You look at Dr. Beauvais. Who would dispute that Dr. Beauvais was a gifted man to be able to develop such a life-saving surgery as he did? But where came that gift? From whence came that gift? Again, ask the questions. I'll tell you where it came from. James 1:17, every good gift and every gift, perfect gift, is from above, and cometh from the Father of lights, that's God, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. So my point is this, to return to it. Any glory and honor that men have that is evident in their accomplishments and in their work is derived from God. But any glory and honor that men have fades with the passage of time. No matter how great Dr. Beauvais' genius may be, he, like the rest of mankind, will get old and feeble. His mind will not work so well as it did when he was young. His hands will become feeble and trembling, and he will not be able to do those surgeries anymore. In fact, it's entirely possible the day will come he will not be able to even remember how he pioneered it. Did you know that Ronald Reagan reached a point, because of the disease of Alzheimer's, he could not remember that he had been the leader of the free world? Talk about a position of glory and honor. He did not even remember that he had been the President of the United States. So whatever glory and honor men have, and they all have it to some extent, we all have rational minds that enable us to develop whatever talents we are given, however few or however many. God does not distribute them all equally, but they all serve their place. I can guarantee you that Dr. Beauvais needs people to haul his trash and keep his plumbing running, just like we do. He needs plumbers. He needs trash men. people to drive trucks, to keep the wheels of society moving, to keep him moving and going to do what he does in his surgeries. And God gives to us rational minds to develop our minds and talents and find our niche in the whole fabric of society so that we all contribute to its function. As he says in Job 38:36, who hath put wisdom in the inward parts, and who hath given understanding to the heart? A man like Dr. Beauvais or any other gifted man simply cultivates and utilizes what God gives him. So here's my point. We look at a Dr. Beauvais, we admire his work, we admire him, we say his work is honorable and glorious. We would even ascribe to him honor and glory because his genius for pioneering it. But here's what we do as Christians. We look beyond Dr. Beauvais and we recognize that it came from God and that it was God that saved Josh's life. And that's why we prayed to God that his surgery will be successful, because they aren't all. And we thanked God when he was brought to church for the first time. And I still remember it vividly, that he was brought to church for the first time. I brought him into this pulpit. I held him in my arms. And I put my hand over his heart. Not that my hand has any kind of magic power. I just wanted my hand to be close to the wonder that had been wrought in that boy's life. And we all sang so appropriately, now thank we all our God with hearts and hands and voices, who wondrous things hath done, in whom his world rejoices, who from our mother's arms hath blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today. We looked beyond the work, even the work of man, to God. In the end, it all redounds back to God. But sadly, with men, their honor and glory fades, and they die like beasts. And that is because men, the brightest of men, the best of men, the most gifted of men, are poor sinners that have sinned against Almighty God. And look, people, there is a work of God that is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. If your glory and honor is ever going to be retained or restored. And that is the work of redemption wrought by Jesus Christ on the cross for his people. You talk about an honorable work of God, a glorious work of God. God so designed the plan of salvation in such a way that all the glory for it goes to him and none of it to us. If you enjoyed all throughout your entire life, if you are the recipient and enjoy all the marvelous gifts and goodness of God that is abounding in this creation, eating good food, enjoying beautiful music, breathing fresh air, enjoying ocean breezes, taking hikes in the mountains, having love in your life and family in your life, and these common blessings to mankind, and yet you do not receive the work that Jesus Christ did on Calvary, you shall perish forever. That's your only hope. Because no matter how good, how great, or how gifted you are a poor sinner that in the end will die like a dog and then face your Maker. And if all you have to face your Maker with is the defiance and neglect of him when he has given you so many gifts and so much goodness, and yet you ignore him, you run from him, you do not serve him, and you have to face him with that, it's not going to be a pretty encounter, I can tell you. The only hope we have is what Jesus Christ did on that cross, done for the glory of God, to bring us from our shame and our dishonor and our sin to perfect righteousness, peace, and glory with God. This is the message of the gospel. And if you fear this God I'm preaching to you, and if you from your heart submit to this God I'm preaching to you, and submit to the claims of His Son Jesus Christ, I declare to you on the authority of the Word of God, you are a child of God and an heir of glory. And whatever honor and glory slips away from you in this world, and it will, because of age and decay, it will be restored in a world to come. Thanks be to the Lord Jesus. I have several verses along that line of the things I said, and I'll, God willing, get to those in another sermon. I think I've given you enough for today.